Verizon knows how to build unlimited right. Start with America's most awarded network.
I'm on my phone 24/7.
Then, for the first time ever, give families more entertainment with Disney Plus, Hulu, and ESPN Plus, now all included.
We're a big soccer family.
Handmaid's Tale. I love
Frozen.
Then give families plans to mix and match, so you only pay for what you need.
You get so much more than this, a great network.
With plans starting at just $35. The network more people rely on gives you more. This is unlimited built right, only on Verizon.
Hello, I'm Maureen Reedy, the President and CEO of the Paley Center for Media, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to a very important and timely PaleyImpact program. We thank our official sponsor, Verizon, and we also extend a very special thank you to the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany for their most generous support of this program. Today marks the Paley Center's inaugural commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. On this solemn occasion, we are honored to present a powerful and thought-provoking conversation titled "The Media's Role in Combating Holocaust Denial, Misinformation, and Anti-Semitism." Recent violent acts that have targeted Jews and other examples of prejudice in our society provide a stark reminder that this fight continues and requires all of us to be engaged and educated about its danger. Never before has Paley's mission been more vital, as media has been the undisputed connector to a nation in unprecedented times. Paley is uniquely positioned to meet this moment with impactful conversations led by influential leaders, such as the people that we are truly honored to have with us today. They will share their insights into media's role in keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive, combating anti-Semitism, and stopping the spread of misinformation, particularly among younger people. It is our privilege to welcome to our conversation some of those that are leading that effort. Monica Bickert, the Vice President of Content Policy at Facebook. Sarah Bloomfield, the Director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Martin Fletcher, former Tel Aviv Bureau Chief for NBC News and author. Eva Schloss, Holocaust survivor. And Greg Schneider, the Executive Vice President for the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. Before we start the program, one brief housekeeping note: if you are tweeting, our hashtag on Twitter is #PaleyImpact. And now I'm so pleased to welcome our moderator, the highly respected journalist, Paula Zahn. Paula is an Emmy Award winner who has been a successful anchor at ABC, CBS, Fox, and CNN. She is now the executive producer and host of Investigation Discovery's On the Case with Paula Zahn, which recently aired its 300th episode. I ask you to please join me in welcoming Paula Zahn.
Thank you, Maureen, for that very generous introduction. And welcome everyone to PaleyImpact, the media's role in combating Holocaust denial, misinformation, and anti-Semitism. Our thanks again to our official sponsor, Verizon, and the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany for their support. Today, through new means of manipulating information and spreading it throughout our connected world, those who seek to deny the Holocaust are more creative and technically savvy than ever before. But across media and culture, many are countering falsehoods with facts and fighting to ensure that one of the greatest crimes in human history is remembered, understood, and not allowed to happen again. Several of them are with me today. As Maureen mentioned, Monica Bickert, Vice President of Content Policy at Facebook. Sarah Bloomfield, Director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Martin Fletcher, former Tel Aviv Bureau Chief for NBC News and author. Greg Schneider, Executive Vice President of the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. And Eva Schloss, a Holocaust survivor. Eva, it is such an honor to have you join us today. We truly appreciate your being willing to share your story. Your family and you were captured by the Nazis. You were held in multiple concentration camps, including Auschwitz, before being liberated, of course, in 1945. What is it that you want all of us to understand, especially young people, about what you've endured?
Well, it was the most horrible genocide ever done. Innocent people were dragged from their homes, just thrown into trucks and deported to death camps, where there were selections. People were selected, older people, younger people, people who looked a bit pale or illish, were immediately taken to the gas chambers and gassed. This is something which never ever happened in history, something so horrible. And it wasn't just in one country, it was in the whole of Europe. And Hitler really wanted to clean out all the Jews with all our culture, with all our belief in the whole of the world, really. Luckily, of course, he was defeated eventually after a terrible 5-year war. And so he only could succeed in Europe. But nevertheless, it was a great damage done to the Jewish culture, to Jewish life. And in general, it's a shame upon humanity. And that people deny that this has ever happened is really, again, a terrible crime and terribly painful for survivors who've lost their families.
As I listen to you so powerfully tell us about what you and your family went through, I wonder just how hurtful it is to know that there are so many Americans out there and people all over the world that in some cases deny the Holocaust happened altogether or say that the toll was greatly exaggerated.
Well, you know, the German government and the Austrian government have never ever denied that what they have done, and they have accepted their guilt, and that is why people get compensation from the German government. So it is officially recognized. But nevertheless, there are evil people in the world who just, well, I have no idea what their reason is, or they are anti-Semitic, or they just want to damage certain people. I just can't understand why people are doing this already 75 years along. This is going on. And that is really a big shame to humanity in general. My family came from Austria. We were a Jewish family, but not Orthodox. So we had many non-Jewish friends. We lived a very ordinary life, like all the Austrian people. It was very nice. We were recognized as good people. And then suddenly in 1938, when the Nazis marched in, even our friends with whom we had been going to the cinema, having a picnic a few days ago, stood in the street with swastika flags and the Heil Hitler salute. My brother, who was 12 years old, he came home from school. His clothes were torn. His face was all full in blood. He looks terrible. And when my parents questioned him, he said, "My friends in school did this, and the teachers watched it happening." This was an unbelievable turnaround of an ordinary population. And that went on later in all the occupied countries which Hitler conquered. It is amazing, even in Holland, where many people said, "Don't worry, we are going to protect you, the Jewish people." Even there were huge people of parties, Nazis, who betrayed people, knowing that they were going to be sent to their death. And till this day, it is something I can't understand. Otto Frank, who became my stepfather, the father of Anne Frank, the famous diarist, he had many court cases against Nazis in Canada, in America, in Germany. people who said, Otto wrote the diary himself. Anne didn't exist. Can you imagine the insult to a man who had lost his children and then evil people saying that he didn't even have a daughter, she'd never existed.
I can't imagine that. And I don't think anybody joining us today could even begin to understand that. Greg, I could see how moved you were as you've listened to Eva share with us her journey. And I wanted to talk about a claims conference survey from 2020 that sort of amplifies what Eva was just saying, that 63% of US millennials did not know that 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. How is that possible?
How is it possible? So thank you, Paula. Thanks for having me today. And I'm honored to be on this panel. 40%, that's almost half of all millennials and Gen Z in the United States, could not name one concentration camp or ghetto when we know there were 40,000 of them. That means they couldn't name Auschwitz or the Warsaw Ghetto or Dachau, Treblinka. So it's deeply, deeply disturbing. The good news is that we also found in the survey that over 80% of millennials and Gen Z thought that it was very important to teach Holocaust in schools so that something like that could never happen again. So clearly there's an interest and an understanding that it should be taught. But right now our policy, our public policy is not aligned with what people think is important, and that needs to change. I just want to say a word about the survey, because sometimes people say, you know, if we just teach people 6 million Jews were killed and it happened on this date in this place, close the book, go to recess. That's not really what we're talking about. The survey is indicators of specific events or facts. What we're really hoping in Holocaust education is that people know the facts, that leads to awareness and critical thinking, so that people really understand the issues. How is it that this could have happened from Jews living in society to slowly, as Eva so heroically told us, her brother being beaten up and the teacher not doing anything about it, to gas chambers? How do you go from one to the other? What's that process? What's that evolution? And what was the role of ordinary citizens? And when students begin to think about that critically, then they begin to think about, well, if I had been there, what would I do? What's my role in society? And then it opens the question of, what is my role in society? What am I willing to tolerate today? And those are the most important questions that when survivors talk to us, of course, they want to memorialize their relatives, their communities that were destroyed. But it's also so important for Holocaust survivors that the lessons of the Holocaust be understood and transmitted to future generations.
I think everybody's nodding in agreement, Sarah, but you have to concede the problem is, no matter how much we try to educate young people and older adults, there is a lot of misinformation and outright lies out there. And I'm curious what you see when you look at the current state of hate groups and how they use media to spread their distortions.
Well, thank you, Paula, and it's great to be with this really impressive panel on this important discussion. I look at the hate groups with alarm, but I also think that they are telling us something that is true, not only in society, but in human nature. And one of the important things of studying the Holocaust is you develop an appreciation of human nature. And I would say this is true of all history. And when I look at some of the things that are problematic in American society, one of my great fears is not only the impact that social media has enabled hate to spread so rapidly and to connect haters, it's that we're not teaching history to young people, and we're not giving them a sense of the context in which past events have happened and how humans behave. So the way to understand, I think, the rise of hate groups and the power of social media, that the way it works on all of us, and I'd like to make a distinction between true believers and people who may be just susceptible and end up going along with true believers. Greg did just a great explanation of the museum's approach to education, which is to focus not just on what happened, not just on the events, but why it happened, what made it possible, what were the decisions people made along the way in face of certain challenges and situations, and what were the motivations. And these are very human motivations. And just to give you one little kind of tidbit from history, we did a major exhibit on collaboration and complicity to address the very problem Eva described with her teachers, her classmates, her friends, people's coworkers suddenly turned on them. And one of the things we learned from this research was that a lot of people ended up being complicit with the Nazis who actually didn't really believe their anti-Semitic ideology. And they went along for other reasons, such as greed or power or career advancement or fear or peer approval, all sorts of very human things that we're all susceptible to.
Monica, I wanted to give you a chance to jump in here. In October 12th of 2020, you announced that Facebook would ban all content that denies or distorts the Holocaust.
Yes.
How are you targeting this hate speech and what are you doing about it?
Yes, and I want to say first that everything that I've heard from Eva's story and the power of hearing about how a teacher and how friends could turn so quickly, and then the comments by Greg and Sarah about what do we do with this? How do we get people to actually not just hear the story and understand what happened, but how do we make sure that they understand human behavior and how people can get swept into hateful ideologies and ultimately violence? How do we actually develop those skills? So when we're thinking about this at Facebook, we're thinking not just about removing hateful content, which is incredibly important. And I'm happy to say we're now removing Holocaust denial in addition to a spectrum of hate speech that we have removed for many years, including attacks on Jewish people, stereotypes about Jewish people that are negative and unfounded and hurtful. We are now also removing anything that denies or distorts the Holocaust. But that's just part of the approach. I think a really important part is making sure that we are using technology. We know that the bad guys, if you will, the abusers and the willful spreaders of misinformation and hatred, they're going to try to use technology to reach a broader audience. They try every day. And so what we need to do is make sure that we are also harnessing the very positive power of social media to educate. You know, if you think about an experience like going to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum or going to Yad Vashem or hearing a story like Eva's, or visiting one of the camps, that's incredibly powerful. But for a lot of people, especially you think about young people in the United States, that's not going to be possible for them to get on a plane and do that. What we can do is use technology to bring that story to them and to help make this experience something they understand so that it will never happen again.
Can you walk us through the steps of how you flag the hate content? How does that work?
Some of it is we allow people to report to us if they see something on the site, and we work with a number of partner organizations around the world who do that. However, at this point, a much larger part of identifying hateful content is using our technical tools. And honestly, if you would have asked me a few years ago if I thought our technical tools would be any good at this, I would have said no, because it's so contextual. Speech trends change every day. We see anti-Semitic content in many different languages. You have to stay on top of all different sorts of words. But I'm now happy to say that when you look at our hate speech that we remove globally, that's not just anti-Semitic content, but any kind of hate speech. More than 90% of that, I think it's now more than 95%, is content that we identify ourselves first with our technical tools. And then we have people look at it, review it, make sure that it is what our tools think it is. But the technology is very important there. I also want to underscore the role of partners. You know, we've worked with groups, Jewish groups around the world in crafting our policies, the World Jewish Congress, American Jewish Committee, Simon Wiesenthal Center. These are really important longstanding partners for us, and they've helped us get to where we are. But their role is not just in helping us craft the policies. They also help us identify language trends and terms. We have a very regular communication with them where they will say, here's a new term we're seeing, or here's a new image we're seeing. And that helps inform the way that we can enforce our policies.
Martin, you covered the Middle East for NBC News. You spent a lot of time in Israel. I'm just curious, through the arc of your career, in your mind, how any anti-Semitism has changed or grown?
Well, let me just begin, Paul, by saying to Eva, my parents have exactly the same story as yours. My parents were from Austria too. Most of their families were wiped out. My mother was the last child in her class, in her school in Vienna when all the other Jews were kicked out. So for me, this is a very personal issue. My parents were both refugees in London. London took them in. In my career, I've always tried to focus attention whenever I could on any issues related to the Holocaust, to anti-Semitism, but I don't think the result was very effective. I think that what are now referred to as mainstream media are not very effective at all in combating this issue of anti-Semitism, because we're so focused on the news of the day and ratings, and I think that any attempt to really push a certain storyline, which, however important I may think it is not the correct thing to do. So I think we don't address the issue as strongly as we could have. The platform of the American network television. I was at NBC News for 30 years, in Israel for 30 years. It's an extraordinary platform which I don't think we used effectively for many reasons. I want to say one thing about anti-Semitism in the Middle East. Often it hides behind anti-Zionism, and also in Europe, and especially on the left wing in Europe. Anti-Zionism is another way of saying anti-Semitism, only in polite terms. But when you're dealing with the Arabs in the Middle East, as I did, I was in Gaza and the West Bank and all over the Arab world. I must have attended at least 200 anti-Israeli demonstrations. And I was in the various wars in Syria and Egypt. And in all that time, not once did I hear the word Israel being shouted, or Israelis. It was always Yehud, the Jews. The fight was with the Jews, not with the country, in the minds of the people on the streets. And I think that's a very important thing for us to remember, that when in the Arab world, on the Arab street, it's Yehud, the Jews. In Europe, in America, that's disguised as Israel, anti-Israel. So for us in the media, in what we call the mainstream media, to make a distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is extremely important, and I think we do a rather poor job of doing it.
Yeah, I think that is a critical point you just raised. I'm curious because I can really identify with what you're saying about how caught up journalists, particularly for mainstream organizations, in the day-to-day headlines, and it's often very difficult to provide context in a piece that airs for a minute 30. What story would you have liked to have told over the years that didn't get on the air when we're talking about these very important issues of misinformation, distortion, outright Holocaust denial? What wouldn't make air?
Well, that's a great question. And I think that the only effective way on television to deal with this is not through trying to persuade people about the rights and wrongs of the Holocaust deniers and pointing out the statistics. The only way to deal with them effectively, I believe, is through people like Eva who tell their stories. And of course, unfortunately, that's a resource that is becoming increasingly rare because of time. And so it's important for us to record their messages, Eva's stories, people like my parents, and find ways to present them. So I mean, one story that I did, which had a huge impact, was a story about a violin, which was found in the Ukrainian forest and was restored by a guy called Amnon Weinstein in Tel Aviv. And that same violin was then played in Auschwitz, and it was played in Jerusalem by by some of the top, the world's most famous violinists. And I did a story on the story of that violin, the story of the boy, the story of the restructuring of the violin. And that was for the Today Show. And the Today Show used the same story 3 times, Paula. You know how rare that is. Then Nightly News used the story. So there's a real appetite for good storytelling. Unfortunately, the best stories are told by the people who lived it themselves. But we in the media need to try and magnify their voices as much as we can. And so that's what I think is the most important thing we can do, is tell the stories of the survivors and of their families as frequently as possible. I don't think persuading young people on the basis of facts and figures works. It just doesn't work. People believe in people. People are interested in people. And so people like Eva, the more Eva, I'm just so impressed by you and your willingness to talk and share your stories.
Martin, it would be wonderful if stories like Eva's could get more airtime. But the fact is that as reporters today, you're confronted with stories that can only run a minute and a half. And stories like Eva's, rarely would get the airtime they deserve. How else should the media confront that?
So I think some
What
really
other
important,
ways?
I think some really important issues have come out hearing firsthand. So first of all, let me reiterate what Martin was saying. The yoke of the responsibility for all of these decades has tremendously laid on the shoulders of Holocaust survivors. I'm very close with a survivor who is a very frail, thin, short, small woman, but her Herculean heroism belies her small frame. She speaks in schools, and she tells me that for a couple of days before she speaks, she can't sleep. She has so much anxiety. And afterwards, she also can't sleep. But she dare not ever deny a request to speak in a school because her sister and her parents were murdered and she owes it to them. It's such unbelievable bravery to relive these experiences. But exactly as we've said, it's a resource that's dwindling. So we have to take on that responsibility. This whole conversation connected with International Holocaust Memorial Day, January 27th, which is exactly 3 weeks after these jarring, horrific events in the Capitol. And I think the conversation for me is in the shadow of those events. There was a news story that one of the rioters was wearing, one was wearing a shirt that said Camp Auschwitz, and another was wearing a shirt that said 6MWE. And I have to confess, I didn't even know what that was, but the 6MWE stands for 6 million wasn't enough, right? So it's a right-wing sort of concept, part of this, crazy extreme. Eva, I'm sorry, I had to talk about it. So number one, what I thought was interesting about, I want to make 3 points. Number one is there is one brief moment that I have to say that the fellow right-wing extremists must be really upset with this, because that actually acknowledges the Holocaust and actually acknowledges that 6 million were killed. So there is a little bit something there that I thought we should point out. But what was interesting is that it turns out that most likely that shirt was not actually worn on that day. That picture that was circulating on the internet relating to that was from, I think, Proud Boys, but probably from a demonstration that happened a month earlier. It was the same group, it was the same city, it was the same type of rally, but it wasn't that day at the Capitol, I think. And so it goes to how lies quickly spread on the internet, and some people say, well, it doesn't really matter which particular rally it was, it's the same idea. And other people say, no, the truth is very important, and we think the truth is very important. But it goes to, I think, a bigger point, which is, if it happened at the rally a month earlier, why weren't we all talking about it then? How is it that we're talking about it in relation to the Capitol, but it had happened a month earlier? If we had made a big deal about it a month earlier, no one would have been confused that whether it happened on December 14th or January 6th. This was not like, I don't know, decades ago in Skokie where we have neo-Nazis who were marching. This was a political rally in our capital, supported by members of Congress and lots of important leaders in our country. And that's what the person was wearing. And nobody made a big deal about it. It was becoming normalized. That is a huge, huge problem in our society that we need to really think about. The last point I wanted to make is that as people are covering, obviously the events at the Capitol were so horrific, and it relates to the core of our democracy. But how many times when people said, and the people there were wearing a Camp Auschwitz shirt, if you think about our study, what we've said is 50% of Gen Z and millennials don't know what Auschwitz is. So they don't understand how horrific, what they're trying to evoke, what that message even means. Imagine if the coverage had been side by side, this is what's happening, this is, and not on the day, obviously, but as we review, this is what they were wearing at the Capitol. And here's Eva Schloss to tell her story. This is what really happened at Auschwitz. This is what they're talking about. So we really have to do a better job at telling the stories, exactly as you said, telling the stories coming out of the Holocaust, but putting in the context of what's happening today and why that Camp Auschwitz shirt, what it really means, and how it's so incredibly outrageous.
Martin, I'm curious why you think that was ignored up until the time of the insurrection. I mean, there were a lot of different pressures when we're filing stories for daily newscasts. I'd be curious your reaction to what Greg was just saying.
I think that there's just not that much interest in the network television for which I can speak, in information that goes beyond the news of the day, and the news of the day, which has been so devoured by Trump for the last several years, takes the news in a different direction entirely. I mean, I think that Greg's point that about the guy wearing the Camp Auschwitz shirt, which when I saw it was completely shocking, and I wasn't really sure when I saw that picture why would he be wearing that shirt? You know, why would anyone let him wear that shirt? And I think Greg's explanation is that people just don't understand what it really means these days. Is a very significant one. I mean, wouldn't it have been wonderful, as you suggest, Greg, if somebody had taken that guy, found him, talked to him while he's holding the shirt, then juxtapose that with somebody who was in Auschwitz and ask him, why did you wear that shirt? What does it mean to you? I'd love to know that. And that's one thing that I did when I, as a journalist, I was always looking for people to going back to somebody who did something and ask them, why did you do that? Who are you? You know, shining some light on that person. I did that numerous times with Palestinian suicide bombers or their families, people who were caught before they blew themselves up. And it's the most powerful way of telling a story, is to connect directly with the individual concerned. So why didn't they do that? Because I think they're just, it wasn't interesting to the editors of the day, as it would be to us. Imagine if I had been, or you had been in that editorial meeting at NBC or CBS or anywhere, and when they showed that the picture of the Camp Auschwitz, if any of us had been in that editorial conference, we would have said, wait a minute, who is that guy? Why is he doing that? What an obvious question. But the people in those editorial meetings didn't ask those questions. They're younger, they're not so aware. I imagine that's the real answer. They just didn't care.
Monica, when Facebook sees an image like that, is that something you would pull, or is it, you know, I'm just curious sort of what metric you use about what you take off the platform.
Well, certainly if somebody used hateful words or a Nazi symbol or a far-right symbol, and there are many of these that we have designated, we would remove it. The exception to that is if somebody is using it to condemn it or to raise awareness, say in educational or news content, in which case we would allow that story. But we review the context every time. And I do want to kind of underscore these hate groups, maybe as Martin says, they're not the most interesting thing to cover in this sort of day-to-day mainstream media landscape, but they are present, and we see new groups emerging. We have to date removed from our site more than 250 white supremacist groups alone. And when I say removed, we remove them, their iconography, any praise or support of them, and any attempt they have to try to come back. 250 just in the area of white supremacy. It's shocking and it's amazing. But I do think an important component of this is not just using the technology to try to remove this content, but also this storytelling theme that we're hearing from Greg, from Martin. I know it's something that we see at the Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem as well. And there is, one sort of bright thing we can look to is how we can use technology to make those experiences more storytelling attractive for young people. And just one quick example of that, we have a gaming platform, Oculus. It's virtual reality. You put on the headset over your eyes and can play video games. And that's something that really speaks to young people. Well, I recently tried an experience that Oculus, our team, worked on with the Anne Frank House, where now you can tour the annex and it's virtual reality. You feel like you are in there, and it has quotes from Anne that are being read as you're seeing things. You're experiencing her room. She's talking about her room. And I watched my teenage daughter go through this experience of wearing that headset, and it was completely natural for her. This is the way that young people experience technology. And that is a way, in some ways, and I've been to the house in person, in some ways, it's almost more powerful to do it through virtual reality because you are alone with Anne. There are no tourists there walking through it. You experience it alone. So I think we have to find ways like that of telling the story in a way that young people can experience it and it will resonate with them.
And Sarah, this is something you certainly have done in your post at the museum. How do you see amplifying stories like Eva's within the
I've been
museum
dying to jump in, so thank you. I'm so happy that this is where the conversation has turned. Just to give you a little factoid, as COVID hit and we went to an all virtual, operating mode, we surveyed educators that we work with very carefully about what did they want from us, and they said stories. And they said, but they want authentic stories. So they want stories that have primary source materials, personal diaries, testimonies, and videos that tell those stories. So we have to do a better job of getting those compelling stories out there. I keep on my desk every day something to remind me of just everything we're talking about. And it's a quote by an author, Richard Powers. And he says, "The best arguments in the world won't change a single mind. The only thing that can do that is a good story." And I think the media could not only tell, obviously, we're in the business of telling Holocaust stories in the most compelling way. The media could think more about storytelling. And storytelling, I want to go back to something Greg said about critical thinking. And lots of people are familiar with the quote by Reverend Niemöller, first they came for the socialists and I wasn't a socialist, first they came for the communists, and the point was I never spoke out and then it was too late. What people don't know about Reverend Niemöller is that he was originally a Nazi party supporter. So he found himself going along with a certain system. And then eventually, as he says, way too late, he realized that he was wrong. How is it that people make that change in their life journey? I'm curious about the man with the Camp Auschwitz t-shirt, and I'd love to hear the story of his life journey. Someone we at the Holocaust Museum have worked with is a young man named Derek Black, who was active in one of the biggest white supremacist groups in the country. David Duke, a former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and a major Holocaust denier, was his godfather. And he grew up entrenched in this community and eventually got out of it. The story of how he did is very interesting. It's not because anybody pointed a finger at him and said, don't be an anti-Semite or a racist. It was through proximity with people. We talked a lot about the ability to be with a survivor and that kind of proximity, but it was proximity with people over time who had a different view of the world and how accepting they were of him just as a person. It's a very interesting story.
Yeah, it was amazing. I think I saw that same interview where he's in college and
yes,
he's with kids from all over the country with different experiences, and just over time he realized just how wrong so many of
I would like to say something.
Oh, please, Eva, jump in. How horrible those thoughts were. Yes, Eva, please jump in.
Last year, I was touring in California, speaking in different schools. And I was just in a town, and they called me and said there is a big private school, and they had a party yesterday. Perhaps you knew the story. They had a party, and they were having Heil Hitler salutes. They were burning candles and swastikas, and it was an all-Nazi big party. And so they asked me if I would be willing to go to that school and speak to the children. They had to leave the school. The parents were called up, and we made a day out of it that the children were called back. There were about 20 youngsters, 16-year-old, and the parents came and those youngsters, boys and girls. And the head teacher was there. And the first question I asked, have the children with 16 years old learned anything about the Holocaust? And he said, he got a bit embarrassed. He said, well, not yet, but we were going to do it next term. So I said, well, with 16, it is high time that they do know already about everything about the Holocaust. And then I asked the kids, what was the motive? Why did you do that? Nobody wanted to reply. Eventually, one said, we didn't really know what it means. And I said, who believes that? You know, you're not living on the moon. You know exactly it is a community where there's a big Jewish population. You must know what it means. Hitler and the Nazis, even if you haven't learned yet about school. So eventually the parents were, of course, very upset and so on. And I said, you know, you can't leave everything to the teachers. You have to teach as well the children something at home. With 16-year-old, it's high time that they know about, I'm sure they have Jewish friends as well, know something about it. Well, the end was, of course, that those children have turned all around. This whole school has turned around. They went to the Washington Holocaust Museum. They have Jewish education now. And it's a completely different, the whole town turned is a completely different community now. And this is really, education is very, very important in school. And I think America is one of the only Western countries where Holocaust education is not compulsory. In Europe, everybody has to take a term and teaching about the Holocaust. And that is really missing in America.
I think what is also missing is someone like you who would call these young children on the behavior, ridiculous behavior they're exhibiting. When you said they didn't know what it meant, and you called them on it. Eva, before we wrap up the whole conversation, I haven't had an opportunity to ask you about your survival. How did you have the strength and courage to stay alive?
Well, in the camp, I was just 15 years old when I was betrayed by a Dutch nurse who pretended she was a member of the resistance. Well, it's a long story. But anyway, we were all deported to Auschwitz in May 1944. And we had a beautiful, and this is very important, I tell this as well always, we had a very beautiful upbringing with loving parents, grandparents, a wonderful older brother, very, very happy life. And with 15 years, I was not ready to die. This is really, you know, there was not a single moment that I gave up hope that somehow I will make it. And this was really the strength of a good upbringing as a young child, a loving home. And unfortunately, nowadays, there is, you know, at that time in the 30s and 40s, there were very few divorces. Families were holding together. Grandparents had a part in the children's education. Now, this whole family life is not anymore how it used to be. The children come home, the parents are busy. They go into their room and they play on their computers and with their things. You know, meals are taken in front of the television. There's no conversation with us after school. When we came home, the parents were asking what homework we had, what was going on. You know, a family life is very, very important to keep people on the right tracks. And that is unfortunately missing now in many, many societies.
Eva, quickly in closing, are you encouraged by what you've heard from our panelists today about the attempts that are being made, not only to educate children about the Holocaust, but removing hate content from social media platforms?
Yes, well, I mean, social media is such a powerful instrument nowadays. We can do a lot on this. Instead of taking bad messages, we can take beautiful messages and beautiful things. I think, you know, we have gone in the wrong direction, and that can easily be changed, I think.
Monica, one quick question about deplatforming, which we haven't had an opportunity to talk about. What do we need to know about that, and what should trigger that?
We will, what I think the most important thing to know is when it comes to hate figures and hate groups, we don't just look at what they are saying on our services. We look offline to see what these groups are doing. If somebody perpetrates a hate attack, so the Pittsburgh Synagogue or Poway or Jersey City, when we have the names of those individuals, this is grotesque, but we will see people try to come online and praise them or set up accounts in their name. What we do is we remove any mention of them unless it is condemning them. And so we do that. We look at offline behavior. We designate hate figures and hate groups and those who have perpetrated hate crimes, and we remove any praise or support for them.
Greg, final thoughts.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in. Well, my first final thought is we need at least another hour.
Yeah, well, I agree
because we're
with
just
that.
beginning to dig into the meat.
No
I
arguments
wanted to
from
say
here.
this. Like on so many occasions, we really should take our instruction from Eva, who just said something so important about the wrong messages, the negative message, particularly in the importance of social media, and B, the negative messages. So I understand we don't have time today, but I think everyone knows that we were active in trying to get social media platforms, including Facebook, to take Holocaust denial down. And we're so pleased that that's part of their policy now, and we think is really, really important. So, but it's a first step. And something that we didn't talk about that we really want to partner with Facebook and with other social media platforms going forward is this idea of driving people toward verified, reliable data. So when you have a horrific event and then you have people who look, what is this, and look into it, those people should not be driven, if you're looking up something about Holocaust denial, should not be driven to other denial sites. They should be driven to the website or data from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum or Yad Vashem or Holocaust survivor stories that might resonate with them. So we have to drive people to the right way. We have to be proactive in finding educational opportunities. And we really want to partner with Facebook, YouTube, whatever, a whole range of social media, because really it's so influential, so important in our society now.
I couldn't agree more. I think this is, and Eva really touched on this, that this is an opportunity to share beautiful messages and to educate. And what we're working on right now, and we'll be rolling out in the coming days, is educational content that we have partnered with some Jewish groups and Holocaust remembrance groups, so that when people and this is on our services, the internet's a big place, but you know, we're going to start on our services and go from there. But when you search for certain terms that are associated not just with the Holocaust, but also with anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, people will be directed to this educational content. I agree very much with what Greg just said, that this is a starting point. It's not enough to just remove hateful messaging. We have to use technology to increase understanding.
Martin, I think it's pretty obvious from hearing you talk today just how deeply you feel about all these issues as someone who's had your family history and what you've done for a living all these years. Just a final thought with your reaction to what you've heard today and whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about the media really making inroads in tamping down this misinformation and outright lies about the Holocaust.
Sadly, I'm pessimistic because this has been with us. Anti-Semitism has been with us for so many, for thousands of years, for many different reasons, under many different forms of media. Social media is what we live with, but under different forms of media for generations, it's been the same. And is it getting better or worse? Well, the statistics show that it's getting worse to some extent, especially in Europe, by the way. And by the way, let me just mention one thing. We're talking about everyone was talking about the 16-year-olds at school and expressing surprise how ignorant they were about the Holocaust and what it meant to put to Nazi salutes and stuff. Do you remember just not so many years ago when Prince Harry was about 16 years old and he was photographed in a Nazi uniform at a fancy dress party? So, you know, this is a member of the royal family, Prince Harry. He wasn't any smarter than those kids in California. Bear in mind, most American major cities have a Holocaust museum or memorial of some kind. Where I come from, in Britain, in England, I think there isn't even one Holocaust museum in England. I don't think so. There's a Jewish museum in London. There's a small museum.
It's up north.
Yeah, near Sheffield. Exactly, there's one. There's one near Sheffield in Staffordshire.
Near Nottingham, a beautiful one, very active.
But that's it for England. That's extraordinary. So yeah, there's a lot of ignorance that needs to be overcome, and I don't think mainstream media are going to do the job. Social media is where the action is today, and telling good stories on social media. And I think Greg makes a terrific point, which is to direct people towards the correct information rather than false information, which Monica, as you say, you're dealing with as a very important issue. I'd say that's the most important point that I've heard today, to divert attention when people go to the internet to find information. They should be sent to the correct information sites.
Sarah, you get the last word.
Thank you. This conversation reminds me of something I'm very fond of saying, which is the world always changes, but human nature never does. And I'm reminded that with the rise of the internet, we did an exhibition examining Nazi propaganda, and not only the messaging, but the techniques. And it was very interesting. You would expect all the messaging to be, you know, very racist, very anti-Semitic. It wasn't all that. A lot of it was very positive. And the Nazis were very careful about public opinion. And they did a lot of local polling, what we would call polling today, to test their messaging to see what was effective. And in some places, it was a very positive message, offering unity, hope, pride, restoring Germany's dignity after humiliating defeat, messages that would appeal to lots of people. And they targeted that anti-Semitic message very carefully. One of the things I'm fond of saying is that the head of the Nazi party, the first head of the propaganda, was Adolf Hitler. That was his first role with the party. And he said something that is very true today. He said, propaganda is a terrible weapon in the hands of an expert. And unfortunately, with social media, anyone can be an expert.
Isn't that the truth? And a sad reality. I have to leave it there. Sarah, thank you so much. And I wanted to thank all of you for joining us for this PaleyImpact program. And we once again thank our sponsor, Verizon, and the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. Be sure to support the Paley Center and consider becoming a Paley member by visiting paleycenter.org. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care.